Okay, we are. Hello and welcome to this live stream with the grand tour trio of politics, I suppose. One who's Jeremy, I don't know, but anyway, my name is Pyotr, and this is the Global Gambit, and this is a live stream. It's not a podcast for once, and I'm joined by two regulars who I do hold in high regard for different reasons. No, largely speaking, they're both fantastic experts. I'll let them introduce themselves, but it's very fun to meet you all if you're watching from either Professor Ker-Lindsay or Professor Rossi's channels. We have a bit of a wide-ranging, spontaneous kind of discussion, really. On my program, I mainly do interviews, but we also do conversations and debates and stuff, and this one's more of just an open discussion. So if you have any thoughts, drop them in the comments below. If you have any specific questions, I am monitoring my live comments chat, so if you want to see anything raised, then do so. I have a few things on the agenda I'd like to hear these guys' opinions about and share some of my own, but other than that, it's just the sort of hour and 90, however many long we feel like going for. I believe James is in Cyprus and Michael is in Central Asia, so we've got and I'm in London, obviously, where it's actually sunny for once. Anyway, gentlemen, it's lovely to have you both on. I will let you introduce yourselves, or I don't know, take it away, maybe James.
Good evening, Pyotr. Thanks so much for the very kind invitation. So for any viewers who might not have come across what I do, I have my own channel sort of looking at international relations, conflict, security, statehood, and try and take a weekly look at various news stories around the world, and it tends to be a bit of a mixed bag. So while I will do things on Ukraine, this week's video was looking at the recent revolution in Bangladesh, and I've covered Colombia and things. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but that's who I am. And by previous background, I'm an academic, sort of specialized on international relations, and done a lot of work on things like secession, state creation, conflict. So come from academia, but now mainly in the YouTube world, which is a bit of a strange one for us academics to get used to.
Yeah, no, 100%. I don't consider myself my level of your academia, but James, thank you. And Mr. Michael Rossi, how are you?
Good to see you all once again. So for those who don't know me yet, my name is Professor Michael Rossi. I'm still in academia. I think it's largely attributed to trauma bonding than anything else. But I am streaming from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, where I am a guest professor at Webster University. Webster is based out of St. Louis, Missouri. They have one of their largest and fastest growing campuses here in Central Asia. So I'm happy to be back to talk about a whole bunch of things. Obviously, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I've just read on Politica today. It's the main newspaper in Serbia. Aleksandar Vučić had given a long response statement to the ongoing tensions in the disputed territory of Kosovo, and what Serbia's responses would be outside of any escalation of conflict. Like Professor Ker-Lindsay, I work in political science. I teach comparative politics and international relations. My YouTube channel started out with older course videos that I had when I was teaching at Rutgers. And recently I have turned my page sort of into a primary source resource for translated, subtitled videos, speeches, press conferences, and interviews, largely by Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, mostly because they are not available to the non-Russian speaking world. So I just provide them as free for those that are interested in getting primary source material outside of just the small snippets that you might see in the Western press. And what else? I'm sure we can find out more things to talk about as we progress here. But I'm happy to be back. I'm actually happy to pick up where we left off a couple of months ago with the three of us about a number of things. So hopefully we can have as fruitful a conversation as we did last time.
And sure we will. For people who are watching across the other two channels, my name's Pyotr, and I'm a mixture of definitely not on the level of those two gentlemen. I work in policy, perhaps more specifically. I've gotten my master's in strategic studies and international economics, and there's a lot of commentators, I think, online who like to talk the talk, but don't necessarily have the credentials to back that up. Not saying that credentialism is everything, but I think unless you've had field experience or a lot of time committed to studying one specific subject, you cannot fully appreciate the nuance and complexities of those issues. Simply having an opinion about something doesn't necessarily mean you have substantive knowledge of it. And there's a lot of bullshit on X, particularly now where we are streaming. If you're watching on X, welcome. But the platform has been inundated, I think, with disinformation and just complete propaganda. It's a shame, really. But so it's nice to have a conversation, I think, is the point, with two esteemed actual experts on various things. Now, you've both mentioned Vucic, or I know James is going to be like, oh, he mentioned Serbia. I want to talk about that. So I do want to touch on Vucic's comments in a minute. But the first thing I'm going to be is biased and talk about British politics, obviously, because that's more important. I'm kidding. But there is the developments, obviously, in the past 24 hours. Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, was meeting Biden. And from the strategic level, when it comes to Ukraine, which is what we cover most on at least my channel, is the meeting between the two. Now, Keir sort of, I think his comments, and I don't know, maybe Michael, we can start with you and what you think about the meeting if you've watched it or watched any news about it, was that Keir emphasized sort of that it was about strategy rather than, quote, a particular step or particular step in my mind, meaning operational level. So I think that this is basically, we'll take in mind also a precursor, which is that Keir is quite a, I think, cautious prime minister, at least when it comes to foreign policy, because it's not necessarily his forte. And I think that this is illustration that neither the UK nor the US really want to antagonize Putin more than they think he already feels he is, although we've seen that Putin's threats can be quite hollow ones. But I also think quite interesting is that the UK has been pretty clean cut in wanting to provide Ukraine the green light to use its storm shadows further into Russia on strategic and relevant sites. But the US has been dragging its feet, and now we seem to have seen the UK step back or U-turn on that idea of the storm shadow commitment. So in my mind, that proves once again that ever since the Suez crisis, the UK has largely just done what the US has pressured it to do. I don't know if you would agree with that sentiment, Michael, but those are my immediate reactions for some of that developments in the UK-US discussion so far.
Well, three things. One, probably the least controversial. I see that you're referring to your prime minister by his first name. He must be that much of a personable individual here, just by calling him Keir. But to be more serious, it's not a surprise that the UK tends to be the more hawkish first. UK was much more hawkish when it came to Yugoslavia. They certainly were hawkish in terms of Iraq in comparison to the rest of Europe. And when it comes to Ukraine, the UK has clearly been more hawkish, all the way back to Boris Johnson's scuttling of any early peace plans that had been agreed upon in the first couple of weeks back in 2022. What this, specifically refers to is whether or not the US and the UK will lift the restrictions on Ukraine using more long-range missiles to fire deeper into Russian territory. Yesterday, I had released a video on my channel, which was just a short interview that Putin had given in St. Petersburg the day before about this very subject. And make a long story short, Putin's response was, Ukraine does not have the capability of A, launching these missiles on their own, and B, knowing the location of the targets that they will fire at. So this means that this is done already in coordination with NATO. So NATO is already directly involved in this war through Ukraine. This he already knows. The second thing, and the newer element, is that if the US and the UK do allow this to happen, and missiles are fired deeper into Russian territory, Russia will see this as a direct involvement by NATO, right? So this is Putin ratcheting up not only the rhetoric, but also the security dilemma. which may explain why the United States took what he said seriously and is sort of hesitating on whether or not they will allow this to happen. And this was supposed to have been an immediate statement by Biden, and then, if I'm not mistaken, the press release was that we'll defer this to the UN Security Council meeting, which I believe took place today. But to my knowledge, I didn't hear anything that resembled a green light given to Ukraine. So in that sense, it seems like the UK was much more willing to take this step up. And I guess when you're playing, sidekick to the United States, you need to have some kind of an independent voice, which the United States will then say, calm down. This may very well lead to a wider escalation of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, when he was asked about whether he was intimidated by Putin's threat of potential war, he said, this is Keir again, or Starmer said, quote, the quickest way to resolve the war in Ukraine, quote, lies through what Putin actually does. He's not really answering the question. He's sort of deflecting it back onto the emphasis of Putin, which, to be fair, is kind of true. But also, he doesn't really want to answer the question. And I don't think Britain has I haven't heard any rumblings yet of the UK expelling diplomats like Moscow did on Friday with 6 British diplomats. So there's that. But James, I mean, what do you think about this? Do you think this is all just tough talk and a little bit of no show, or not?
Well, I mean, it was very interesting, wasn't it, that there wasn't any official announcement. That can be read in several different ways. Now, it might mean that they took a decision, but they have decided for one reason or another that they want further consultation, perhaps with NATO partners, before making an announcement. Or perhaps they'll just make the decision and communicate it to Ukraine, and then we'll see what happens then. So, I mean, it's rather difficult to read exactly what no announcement means, because, of course, it might mean that they agreed to differ, at least for the moment. And so no decision has been taken on allowing this. But I think you're very right. I mean, the idea that the UK does tend to be a bit more hawkish at times than the United States, and perhaps plays that sort of role of saying, well, look, we've got to do something, as compared to what you would probably see from a lot of other NATO allies, which would be much more sort of cautious on what's happening. So I think, yes, to a degree, the UK does seem to play that sort of role. But of course, then there are the big strategic picture that one needs to consider, and I think a lot of people will feel that allowing the use of these missiles is an unwarranted extension of the war. And I think, what we've got to be clear about is the different types of targets that one will be using. Now, I don't claim to be a military expert. I've never served in the forces. I started my career at Rossi, which is the main international relations military think tank. So I'm not completely out of all of this. But I should say that, I think there's a world of difference from what we're talking about of long-range missiles that would be used to attack military targets and the use of long-range missiles to attack civilian targets. I think if Ukraine were to start using long-range missiles and start to target civilian targets, then we would be in a particular area which I think would be very much more complex and complicated and much more likely to force Russia's retaliation. But of course, if we're looking more in terms of using these to hit quite far behind Russian lines, military targets, so for example, supply depots, transportation hubs, that I think would be something that could be very well justified as sort of saying, well, look, it's important to take the war to Russian forces operating in Ukraine. But if Russia can just simply keep resupplying them from further back, and Ukraine's hands are tied in being able to do that, then all we're doing is prolonging a war unnecessarily that Ukraine might be in a strong position to win if it was given this capability. So I think it's really important to sort of think a little bit and not just say this is a disastrous move because it's going to be sort of long-range missiles. I think it's very clear to sort of differentiate between the different uses, and the fact that you can make quite clear political and diplomatic arguments for allowing those missiles to be used against military targets. And I think, we're not going to be privy to the discussions that are going on, obviously, between Washington and Kyiv on the use of those missiles. But I could well imagine that Washington will say, look, please, if this is going to get the go-ahead, the green light to do it, then it's got to be focused on military targets, because if you start raining down these missiles on civilian areas, then we're going to be dealing with a much more difficult position, and we're much more likely to lose international public relations at the same time. So I think it's going to be a very delicate balance, but it's not simply the case, do you use these missiles or not? There's a lot more to this discussion.
Yeah, I think that it's the well, this is why I'm not sure where I sit yet. I'm obviously understanding of the perspective. I think on the main, if we put it in the spectrum, right, people who are more Ukrainian aligned or pro-Ukraine will argue that the dithering within NATO and Western governments is only benefiting Moscow because it's what Putin wants. He likes to see this inaction, this inertia, infighting almost, because the West is not sure how far they want to support Ukraine. But if their argument is, that if we support Ukraine 100%, no limitations, the Russians will not have a response to that, because it's unlikely Putin's going to nuke his own territory. But then on the other side, there are more of the restraint camps, which are like, well, yes, but still, can we take that risk? Because once we trigger a sort of nuclear escalation on ladder, then it's very hard to go back. And striking strategic sites, even if they're within, international humanitarian law, one does whether. I think the main point I've thought, at least I'll put it this way, is that what happens when Russia receives something that it is not happy with, it reacts, or Putin reacts, the Kremlin reacts in quite a reckless sense. I'm thinking particularly the Kerch Bridge, when the Ukrainians took out that in late 22. The response was to blanket the whole of Ukraine. So if the Ukrainians are willing to take the risk of strategic strikes on, military infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and so on, that would likely result in absolute blanketing of the Ukrainian state by the Russians, and only lead to more, suffering and bloodshed. And then we get into this perpetual deteriorating cycle. You know what I mean? Obviously, though, the Russians could be like, well, that's not, something that we're willing to put up with. We're going to go even further. I think one of you wanted to jump in, so whoever that was, go in.
Well, I agree. I very much agree with what James had said, and I like the differentiation between the military and the civilian targets. We also need to be clear that as far as the Russian narrative is concerned, all the Russian press statements have said that this war is operating as long as it has been, largely, if not entirely, because the West is propping up Ukraine. The US, the UK, NATO are telling Ukraine where to shoot, where the targets are. So if Ukraine decides, and this is a big if, because giving Ukraine the weapons is one thing, having them decide where they're going to fire is something else entirely. If it's military, it could be seen within the boundaries of warfare. If it is civilian, Russia is going to most likely say that this was done with the coordinated approval of the West. This is not an accident. This was deliberate. And so even if Ukraine decided on its own to make this unilateral action, Putin, Lavrov, everybody is going to say that this would not have happened without the US and the UK knowing, in which case they will be complicit.
Yeah.
Can I jump in? Because
go for it, James.
Quite interesting, because I'm trying to monitor some of the comments coming in on my channel, and actually that was one of the sort of really great question from one of my viewers, Ben Keats, asking why hasn't NATO ever just given a wink and a nod for Ukraine to use the missiles, and Ukraine disobeys them and uses the missiles to strike Russia anyway. And I think that sort of pretty much hits that either way it will be seen as sort of something that has been given the go ahead in Russia, and I think Russia will sort of see it that way. But I think we've got the problem that seems to be that things have gone, if you like, as far as they can go in Ukraine, and there is this sort of sense of frustration that we're seeing in the Ukrainian government that they need to be able to do more in order to make sort of progress, rather than leave this as a rather bloody stalemate. This isn't a war that's over yet. We haven't got to that sort of frozen conflict stage, which we could get to, and I don't think a lot of people would be particularly happy to see that for all sorts of reasons. I mean, we just need to look at what's happened, for example, in Transnistria. We need to look at what's happened in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, that this just then becomes a perpetual source of instability. And I don't think anyone in Ukraine wants to see this prolongation. And it has much wider effects. I think there is probably a sense in many quarters that maybe it's better to give Ukraine the tools it needs to win this war, try and push ahead for a decisive victory, however that's achieved, whether that's a question of trying to force Russian forces out, or perhaps making the conflict so costly for Putin and seeing this incursion that we've seen into Russia, whether that there is, and I really don't know whether this is something that is realistic, something Michael might have a better insight into, some sort of palace coup or even coup in Russia that forces Putin out and then sues for peace, which I think is one scenario that a lot of people seem to hope will happen. I don't know how realistic that is.
Well, they've been hoping for that since they've been hoping for that for years, and as much as this war will end on the political sphere, not on the military battlefield, the likelihood of some kind of internal coup is non-existent, right? It's Putin has pressure, but it's negligible compared to other leaders around the world who might face similar sorts of. And even Maduro has more likelihood of being sort of removed, even though his opposition has now fled the country. But the point is, Putin has spent 25 plus years of his life deliberately purging, or mini purges, as they've been called by some, to really consolidate his position. And I just don't think this whole idea of a sort of I was listening to a conversation with Anne Applebaum here in London about a week ago, and I chatted to her briefly afterwards, and she was saying that the likelihood of a post-Putinist is, well, that was my question. I was like, we can all think about a Russia without Putin, but the point is, if you've got late people like Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who is he was the former founder of the LDB party, which stands for the Liberal Democratic Party, which was actually, it's not democratic at all, it's ultra nationalist. He made Putin he was very critical of Putin for not being hard enough in Ukraine. So the point is that my mother said the best way of summing it up once, and she doesn't follow geopolitics really much at all, and it was better the devil you know. Right, so at least we think we know what we get with Putin, whilst if you get someone completely new in, holy shit, this situation now with an escalatory potential use of weapons and strikes by Ukraine in parts of Russia would be a lot worse. Again, I'm not saying that's sort of that creates some kind of solution or answer, but it's wishing for a coup by Putin is one thing, but then sort of the day after is sort of another, and it doesn't necessitate the end of the war in Ukraine, I think is the point. But anyway, I don't know, Michael, if you disagree with any of those comments, or if you want to jump back on, push back against James or something.
No, there's no pushback. Actually, this is we all are largely in agreement.
Well, you're the more sort of realist of the show. Whenever we have the conversations, I'm a naive young idealist, and you're the realist.
I tend to be the realist. I mean, I guess if I'm going to be the buzzkill here, then yes. I mean, based on all the evidence that we have seen, there is no indication that there would be any kind of palace coup to remove Putin. We have to also remember, and this is something that unfortunately is, I think, propagated in the West, that Putin is just this maniacal, tyrannical dictator that's holding this country hostage. And if the people could just simply rise up and overthrow him, then everything would be wonderful again. Again, it's an echo chamber in the West, and Western governments tend to collapse a lot faster than Russia does. I mean, if you want to talk about a palace coup, look to my country just a couple of months ago, where we finally bumped off Biden and replaced him with, his VP. So, the understanding Russian politics is realizing that Putin is more or less a chairman, not a emperor, not some czar. He is there, at the behest of a large security apparatus, which demonstrated its ability to remain solid about a year and a half ago with, the whole Prigozhin mutiny. And even other private military organizations like Ramzan Kadyrov's Akhmat Group openly sided with the state, openly sided with Putin against Prigozhin. So if there is any kind of attempt by that, I mean, I think it's just, these are people who spend way too much time reading the New York Times op-ed section, believing in this kind of stuff. So, I mean, based on all the evidence, that's it.
Yeah, I think you're pushing it a bit with the comparison. I clearly you're a MAGA man by the sounds of it, but do you really think it's fair to compare the forced, I don't know, removal or stepping down of Biden to a sort of a coup within Russia? Or are you being a bit facetious? I feel that's
I'm being a bit facetious. I wouldn't presume to even remotely. I'm not MAGA, and I'm certainly not blue, and I'm not blue. Vote blue, no matter who. They're both cults. I can't stand either one here.
I
don't know who I'm voting.
Asia, right? Okay.
Yeah, that's why it's a nice, it's just a nice, quiet, stabilitocratic,
a nice,
state,
actual authoritarianist state. Okay,
very good. It is what it is. No, I mean you obviously cannot make a one-to-one comparison between what happened to the United States with Putin, but I mean, maybe you could just say it this, democracies have much more of an opportunity of self-correcting themselves, even outside of election seasons. Authoritarian states don't. They will self-correct only under the most dire of circumstances. The decision to replace Biden with Harris, I think, was just made visible in the months prior due to his inability at handling himself in the debates with Trump, and Trump's popularity just going through the roof after that assassination attempt. Things are now different. Right, things are now very, very different. And to this point, I actually want to throw in. Right, let's talk about the presidential election, which we are about less than 2 months away from. It is now. Guys,
well, it's really nice streaming with you. Got to go if we're gonna. I'm joking, but we're gonna start talking US presidential already. Okay, no, go on. I have water here. If I knew we were talking that, I would have got a bottle of whiskey, man. Jesus. I drink responsibly, audience. Sorry.
Well, what I'm saying is that we are sort of within a power vacuum right now within the United States. And if we put that into the context of the Ukraine war, we have a sitting president that is largely now lame duck. We have the heir apparent, Kamala, who will most likely continue with the foreign policies that Biden was told to adhere to. Which means that this is potential good news for Ukraine, because Trump had made it very clear that if he wins, he would sue for peace, end the war with Russia, and that would ultimately mean something that Ukraine would have to make major concessions over. Of course, whatever Trump was suggesting to end the war presupposes that Putin would take it. So unless Trump offered Putin everything that Putin has laid out in his alleged peace plan, it's not going to work. But now that Trump is at best polling even with Harris, and he was polling even just before the previous debate, and then she seems to have now widened her lead afterwards, it looks like that situation might be avoided. And so the United States is going to continue with its policy of supporting Ukraine. But also to this question, and this is something that you made beforehand.
I want to get Michael James's take on this as well.
Supporting prolonging the war, keeping Ukraine alive for the next 2 weeks does not reverse the situation, does not give Ukraine the tactics to retake land. It just keeps them alive. That's all.
James, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the sort of the comment on Trump's position, I mean, it was very telling. I mean, when you see J.D. Vance sort of, when questioned about this, essentially gave, his response seemed to indicate that the way out as a returned President Trump would see is to draw the battle lines as they are, essentially hand over that territory to Russian control, and ensure that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, that it remains neutral. So essentially, it would be handing. I think many of us would see it as that would be handing Russia the win, if that's the way that Trump really does envisage peace. And I can see why a lot of people would feel that this is extremely troubling. And I think this sort of comes back to the fact that that there is an intense naivety that exists amongst the MAGA crowd about how the world works, and an inability to look beyond the bigger picture, to look to the bigger picture that we're seeing in Ukraine. So, I've worked on a lot of peace processes over the years. It's something that I fundamentally believe in. But, as I've pointed out on a number of occasions, I don't think this is a normal war. I think this is much, much more significant. I think what we're seeing here is a permanent member of the Security Council, a major nuclear power that has marched in and seized the territory of another country and annexed it. Now, we discussed in our previous conversation about links with Kosovo, and it's at this point that all the Serbs get terribly exercised and say, what about? This falls into a very different category. I think, the significance of this cannot be underplayed. This is a major country that has turned international relations on its head and said the established rule that we will no longer allow conquest of territory by force by states of the UN to go ahead has just been completely swept away. And I think the implications of this are so much more. So the idea that somehow you can, you're going to bring the war to an end in Ukraine, and that everything's going to be right in the world if you permit this to happen, I think is dreadfully naive and extremely dangerous in terms of what it means for international law and standards. Now, and again, I can already hear the voices shouting, but what about what the West did and things like that? This is not denying, and I have been very, very open in my criticisms of what the West has done in recent years and the steps it's taken that's laid the path to where we are now, this very troubling path. But this does fall beyond what, for example, we saw in Iraq. So Iraq was a violation of sovereignty. It was a violation of Iraq's independence, but there is still a united Iraq. It is a single country that the United States hasn't tried to annex any of that territory. It's now left it. It's a very, very different situation than what Putin has done, which is not just go in and say, look, I'm just going to establish a security zone. He has formally annexed first Crimea and now parts of eastern Ukraine. This, as I say, goes well beyond. This is a land grab. And as I say, I think, we need to get our heads around this and all the implications of that. And I think hopefully we'll talk in a little bit about the nuclear element of this, because I think this is also very important, because the other fears that I have is that because all this has taken place with implicit nuclear threats, which again is something very different than we've seen in other conflicts, it potentially opens up the ground for other countries to turn around and say, well, look, we're not going to end up in that same situation. We have now got the imperative to develop our own nuclear weapons. So I think, that's also a debate and a discussion I hope we can move to, because I think that's incredibly important. What happens if, for example, nuclear weapons are used, or the wider nuclear debate. And I know this sounds like scaremongering, but it is something that we do need to be thinking about.
No, I think you have to. I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't ever talk about nuclear doctrine, then you're not going to have much of the game theory and the chess moves will be non-existent, right? There, if you don't talk about it. No, I mean, I agree with you, James and Michael as well. We had, my show is obviously mainly interviewing other people. We had Lawrence Friedman on, who I'm sure you're familiar with, James, maybe Michael as well. But, one of the main things we were talking about is this normalization of the use of military force again. I think the thing that a lot of people have become very, particularly my generation and younger, sort of very just, I don't know, not even accustomed, that's not even more than that, just sort of completely ignorant of, is how lucky they are that, right, you don't live in a world where, the likelihood of wars breaking out every 20 minutes is sort of, is a thing in Europe, and how much that's changed in such a short space of time. Of course, there was the Yugoslav wars and conflicts do continue to occur, but I'm talking about among advanced economies where the technology element is that much more potentially destructive. And then we also had a chat with, what's his face, Ankit Panda, he's a nuclear, he studies at the Stanton, he's a Stanton Fellow for the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And, we were talking a bit about how, because of what Russia's been doing in Ukraine, and obviously China's militarizing with its interests more toward Taiwan, they are shifting significantly towards proliferation, right? In the past few years, we've seen satellite imagery of these missile silos, and China just basically wanting to sort of get on par in terms of its nuclear arsenal and stockpiles, so that they can have deployed. I think Russia has about 1,500 deployed missiles. So China's like, well, if we want to be considered conceptually, symbolically as a great power, we need that nuclear component as well, because we have the economy, we have the political element, we have the foreign policy influence, but we don't have the nuclear element that makes us, because, you know, people will argue Russia's not a great power anymore, but you still have to pay attention to what the Kremlin's talking about, because it has 1,500 actively deployed nuclear weapons. So you know, it's obviously there's no singular definition of power. But yeah, so I think that's what I find pretty disturbing, is just how much it's changed, sort of, and is normalized things that we never used to think would be that way in this day and age. But that being said, I am monitoring the comments, everyone. So I am taking note of questions that you're asking. And one of them, I think, we will touch upon is the military element. The one thing I did want to respond to, though, is that a lot of people responded to your point about self-correcting, Michael, and it triggered a bunch of people, because they were like, the West's not self-correcting, it's in perpetual state of decline, the West is over. And I mean, yeah, sure, we've got our own issues in the West, but I don't think we're in a perpetual state of decline, because I'm still waiting for the reserve currency of the renminbi, guys. How's the BRICS doing?
The West has been in a perpetual state of decline since Pliny the Elder wrote about it. So I mean, you know, the West has been. Look, in my weaker moments, sure, I will absolutely say, you know, the West is, you know, in a downward spiral. It's not paying attention to the rest of the multipolar world. But we have to pay attention to the undeniable fact that at the absolute best, we are in a multipolar world, of which the United States is a major player in. Regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of which party controls Congress, the United States was, is, and will remain a major global power. That might be, you know, to some people's satisfaction, that might be to other people's detriment. But I mean, that is, you know, effectively what it is. The reality, though, and this is something that a lot in the West, both policymakers and, unfortunately, I have to say, increasingly a number of academics and scholars seem to be ignorant of, is that it is no longer 1996. It is no longer the age of Pax Americana. It is no longer the age of American unipolarism, where we can do whatever we want. I mean, that was, you know, laid bare.
Primacy was in the 90s, wasn't it? It was in the early 2000s until 2008, really. Wouldn't you agree? U.S. primacy was predominantly then?
U.S. Global supremacy, I think, reached its apex with the bombardment of Yugoslavia and the whole Kosovo situation. It took its first hit, no pun intended, with 9/11. And it was in a very slow downwards, but the war on terror with Iraq, certainly the 08-09 economic crisis. I think the most poignant example that the age of American unipolarism was over was the complete collapse of Afghanistan, and you know, the Taliban going from, you know, there's this great scene. I don't know if you know this movie. It was I think it was in English it was called sort of like The Curse of the Golden Flower or something like that. It was a Chinese movie, takes place in Imperial China. It's you know, Chow Yun-fat, one of those Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon type of movies, and it showed the omnipresence of the emperor, and there was a coup against his rule by his adopted son. And like the last 10 minutes of the movie was, you know, battle fighting, sword fighting, bloodshed, whatever it is. And when the coup was over, the palace guards, the palace staff effectively washed away all signs of the battle within the palace, replaced the crushed flowers with new flowers, new carpets, new everything, as if nothing had ever happened. Like, this is basically what happened in Afghanistan with the Taliban. So, you know, my point here is that, you know, the West is not in decline, but the West certainly no longer has a monopoly on shaping the global order.
Yeah, I said this for people who are interested. On my page, you can find a conversation I had with Stephen, or Destiny, as he's better well known on YouTube and social media. But the point I was making, and James, I'd love to bring you in on any thoughts you've heard so far and wish to respond to, which is that it's not I don't think obviously the West is facing challenges, but so is every country. China is relatively facing a huge housing market issue. No, it's not necessarily about to boom and blow up like everyone likes to scaremonger. I'm not doing that, right? There's a middle ground, and I try to be balanced in that. But China has economic headwinds, demographic headwinds, systemic issues, of which I don't think can be denied in a way that the US doesn't, at least at the moment. The US doesn't have a demographic crisis. Depopulation is a huge issue everywhere in the world, apart from Africa, but it's particularly bad in China, where you've got 800,000 people dying, or a net loss of 800,000 people within a year because of population changes and the policies of the first child and so on. So anyway, so the point is that there are a lot of issues. So whilst I think the US and the West are facing fluctuations in issues, I think what's relatively happened is the West hasn't so much declined as others have just come up. Right, China has grown hugely in the past 15 years. Russia has re-emerged itself, albeit in irregular, inconsistent ways or unpredictable ways. There's a lot more middle powers, right? Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the Arab Emirates, Brazil, South Africa, India. Many more countries are much more willing to express their displeasure or dissatisfaction with the status quo of the international system, hypocrisy of Western countries in how they talk about things in the UN, but then act in their own foreign policy. I think that's what's changing. It's not so much the West has suddenly blown up and ruled, Pompeii, Vesuvius kind of scenario. I don't know, James, if what I'm saying would align with anything you think, or am I talking garbage?
Well, no, no, Pyotr, of course. Listen,
I don't know. It's the English self-deprecation.
And this is a problem with doing live stream, isn't it? You can't go back and edit, and so it wasn't meant like that. No, look, what I would say is that I remember thinking at the time of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. That this, to my mind, seemed that inflection point that future historians would determine amounted to the end of the post-Cold War period. So, we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disintegration, and the end of the Cold War. And it did herald this period that I think looked like it was the era of US power. And I mean, those of us at a certain age, and I can actually well remember it, that period of the 1990s, because that was when I was going off to university and I was doing my PhD in international relations, and it was a very different era. It was an era of optimism. It was that sort of sense that the Cold War is over. The United States has won this decisive victory. Now we're going to see a more stable world. I mean, don't forget, we were all reading Francis Fukuyama at that time. Well, I mean, we weren't all reading it. I mean, there were the two texts which defined the 1990s in many ways, which you had the Fukuyama thesis on the one hand, that, that was it. It was the end of ideology, end of history, last man. It was the victory of liberal democracy, and the world was going to settle into a technocratic era where more and more countries would be won over to liberal democracy, and we'd all live in this utopian vision. And then, of course, you had the Huntington argument on the other hand, the clash of civilizations and all the rest of that. I won't sort of go into that, but it's more to say that there was a tremendous sense of optimism at the start of the 1990s. And, I did my PhD on peacekeeping. Now that was, wow. You can often tell when somebody did their PhD by the big sort of conceptual subjects they were doing. There's a whole raft of us who have PhDs in UN peacekeeping because this was seen as the big thing in the early 1990s. You had the big missions. It was state building. It was going beyond the old missions where you send in a peacekeeping force between two fighting factions. That was a Cold War type of peacekeeping. Now we were going to go into state building, and the United States was at the vanguard of that. And then, of course, we started to see actually fairly early that began to crumble. And even though we think of it as around 9/11 in Iraq, many would actually place it to Somalia. That when the UN the United States went in there, it was the hyperpower, not even superpower at that point. We were talking about the United States as the hyperpower. and it got a bloody nose. And I actually wonder, I often ask students these days how many people have seen Black Hawk Down. Now, at one point that would have been everyone. I mean, it is an absolute classic for all sorts of reasons. Ridley Scott, but a lot of the younger generation haven't seen it, but it is a really clear example of how the United States, and perhaps it's difficult to get the full context of it today, but that was actually a really powerful telling of hubris gone wrong.
The AMISOM. No, I mean, the AMISOM, I think, missions were. I worked. Well, from my experience of working in the UN, I've obviously done a lot of reading into its history and the missions. I mean, obviously the Rwanda genocide being another massive failing at the multilateral level.
And Srebrenica was
Srebrenica and possibly
together, which actually sort of really started to kill off the idea of peacekeeping. Working together, it was like, this was the great hope, and then it failed. But I think the point I was trying to make was that in a more general sense is that we had this period and then the slow decline in the second decade of that post-Cold War period, which actually the first decade of the millennium, and then that drift from 2010 to 2020, 21, and the US pullout from Afghanistan. And I remember thinking, right, okay, this bookends that post-Cold War period. I'm not so sure now. I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has actually completely backfired in the sense of marking that end of Western power. I think, what we've seen is it's actually given the West a new lease of life. We've seen this with NATO membership, the fact that you've got countries like Finland and Sweden that have now joined up. I think there's a much greater sense in the West of its purpose, that yes, there are differences that exist, that do exist, but I think there is a much greater unity. So in many ways, I think that if Russia's idea was to herald a multipolar world with what it was trying to do in Ukraine and thought that maybe we'd already moved into that, perhaps that was Putin's thinking after what happened in Afghanistan, that's it. The United States is now weak. I think it's backfired tremendously. And as I say, none of us are going to be around. Well, maybe Pyotr, you're going to be around in 50 years. I think you're a little bit younger than Michael and I to see what people say of it. But I expect that I'm going to be reading.
If you're living in a blue zone in Cyprus, James, but I don't know. It depends what you're doing.
Yeah, well, hopefully, and all the rest of it. But
for people, I just want to make a couple of administrative points here, as well as a couple of others, and then I'll circle back to you, Michael, for any thoughts you have, because I'm sure you do. Which is I'm starring questions and points. So Dice Media Group, that was your question. I starred it, so we're going to come back to it because I think some of these are really interesting. All of them I appreciate. Well, not all of them, but most of them I appreciate. And thank you also very much to Aeon. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. So if you've got any questions, do drop them in the comments. I like to try and engage with as many of you as possible. I think that people can stream and just sort of like to hear themselves talk and not really care what's being said in the comments. I don't think any of us three are actually like that. But also, I think do check out these gentlemen's pages if you haven't. James does remarkable deep dives about everything around the world. He did one on Bangladesh, which I'm very glad he has done. I'm intending to do one on Sudan, although mine are a mixture of my own analysis and interviews or conversations. And Michael's is, Michael's is interesting because he spends hours upon hours looking at Putin's mouth moving and understanding what's coming out of it. It's very important work. He literally translates verbatim from Russian into English, and I think that's incredibly useful and valuable as a resource for those of us who want to not have a Western spin or simplification of the narrations, but a direct translation. And he is also doing more of his own personal analysis and lectures and things. So I do encourage you to look at Michael's page as well. But just a couple of points to what you said, James, which is that I think that AMISOM and AMISOM 2 are some of the most disastrous humanitarian attempted missions in history. For people who aren't aware, it's to do with the UN sending in, led by the US, obviously, going into Somalia in the 1990s, and it was a disaster. It led to huge amounts of famine, infighting, and has basically led to what is the failed state of Somalia today, and the continued desire of Somaliland, which is a breakaway province in the northwest, to become its own state. And it's very shameful, I think, that not more attention or admittance of this is given. We've had a couple of questions on the UN, which we will come to probably at the end, because it's not that sort of time sensitive. But I also think it's worth, we've seen a few comments and sort of touched upon it, and Michael, this is where I'll come in with you, is Trump, right? Trump's foreign policy, and a video I'm planning to do in the next week of my sort of analysis and breakdown is sort of trying to do, there's a really good article from Foreign Policy, which I'm using as a basis. The author's given me his willingness for me to use it. But the point is that different presidents have different ideas of foreign policy, and Trump's idea of foreign policy is isolationism, right? To become some kind of autarkic state, effectively like North Korea. And what I think is very naive, and I don't mean this necessarily in a nasty sense, is that I think a lot of people who support Trump believe naively that if you withdraw all of your foreign influence or intervention or interference in other parts of the world, that somehow is going to mean that other countries are going to stop interfering in your affairs. That's not how it works. Even if the United States stopped all of its, trying to encourage democracy in Africa or being present in the Middle East, China and Russia will continue to disrupt or destabilize or influence, if you want to be less provocative in your words, American internal issues, right? We've seen yet again this just recently, the developments around Russian influence in American elections, and just generally the guy Tim Pool and that whole media group, right? All those influences, right? So it's happening, guys. And just because America becomes isolationist doesn't mean it will stop happening. It just means you'll have even, you'll be perceived as even weaker in the international system. So take your pick. But Michael, I don't know. Am I talking nonsense again?
I mean, we're all talking nonsense to somebody online. But no, I mean,
so diplomatic. There's mine before you go.
I think that there are two large groups of people in the United States that misunderstand Trump and his foreign policy. The first one are the anti-Trump camp, who thinks that we're going to just sort of ally with North Korea and Russia and destroy democracy. And then the other one are those that truly believe that Trump was isolationist. He had 4 years as president, and if you count isolationism as not starting another war, then okay, I guess. But Trump's 4 years as president, we orchestrated one of the sloppiest and most disorganized attempt at overthrowing the government in Venezuela. We made it openly clear that our interests in Syria are for oil. We moved the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And his foreign policy, I mean, we've been dancing around the Israeli issue now for almost an hour. So let me just pop that balloon. If Trump becomes president, he is going to give Netanyahu an absolute green light to final solution the entire Palestinians.
You think?
So to suggest, yeah, absolutely.
But he's not very good friends with Netanyahu. You've seen
it doesn't matter.
He turned up.
No, it doesn't matter. The evangelical vote has that. The U.S. foreign policy's approach to Israel is absolute green light, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. So to suggest that Trump is isolationist is, I don't know how or where people come up with that. I guess because of the disengagement from places that he feels we should not interfere in. He does play into a very large, growing sense of isolationists in America. And this usually happens every couple of decades, is that we have some overseas blunder, and then everybody says we should never have gotten involved in the first place, let the world burn, screw you, just build the wall, take care of our own people, which we never do anyway, and everything will be fine. So, if, Trump's isolationism is more or less an America First point, but he's very much in favor of advocating America First in areas around the world where we should be. And for that, it's Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, especially when it comes to to Israel. His statements, I don't know if he, really was going to make good on this, but I remember him saying at some point that U.S. is either going to pull out of NATO because it's outdated, or countries that don't pay their fair share are not going to get protected by the United States. And that, of course, was met with all kinds of controversy at the time. But we also have to, this will be the last thing that I'll say on this, but we also tend to forget, Americans and other people around the world tend to forget that U.S. presidents operate within an intricate check and balance system. And I'm not just simply talking about judicial and legislative. I'm talking also about, you can say what you want when you are campaigning for president. When you get elected, the Pentagon and the State Department give you two large handbooks on this is how you operate the country. Remember, when Obama was running for president, we were all super excited because he's going to make the world better. We're going to close, Club Gitmo. Everything's going to be fine. And he ended up, drone bombing, God knows how many weddings. And, today we're all like, America's the most lethal fighting force in the world. This is Kamala's whole thing. We'll be the most lethal fighting force in the world. So, everybody is, still arguing over how we can, control large parts of the world more patriotically. So the military, the State Department, the Department of Defense, they're all going to have some way of guiding the president one way or another, because policy is policy. Commitment issues around the world will not suddenly change like that. We are not going to do a 180 abrupt turn. I think that's abundantly clear.
Okay, well, I want to switch gears a little bit because I think.
Can I just quickly jump in and say that?
No, you can't. Sorry.
So I've got. I'm going to put back a little bit on Michael on this one, because I think that what he's referring to is the normal run-of-the-mill type of presidential system in the United States. And I think what made Trump so disruptive was that in all sorts of ways you could see how he was breaking those boundaries. And I think you're very right, Michael. I mean, I think that is how usually things would be done. The Pentagon, Department of Defense, State Department would keep presidents in check and sort of define the boundaries of decision making. So anyone who's ever worked in the civil service, I mean, this is exactly how you do. You present the leader or the minister or whoever it is, secretary, a cabinet secretary, with the options. But you've defined those options, and that creates, if you like, a wall around it. And I think what we saw with Trump is time and time again going beyond that. So one small example, but I think it was really interesting because it was very telling. Trump traded, and this is something, I've spoken a bit about on my channel, Western Sahara, which probably means nothing to a vast number of viewers, which was a territory that had been granted the right to have its own referendum, but Morocco had annexed it in the 1970s and had denied it that. And it had long been US policy that referendum on the future should be able to take place. And as part of Trump's policy, in order to get Arab state recognition of Israel, he effectively said, well, not effectively, did say to Morocco, we now accept that this is Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara in return for Morocco recognizing Israel. And this was something that upset a lot of traditional Republicans. And it was a sort of decision that one would not have expected usually. So as I say, it seems minor and we can point to other ones. But I think that there was a very clear example that Trump was pushing the edges. And I think the worries that people have now is that, having served as president before, he now knows the ropes and he won't be constrained at all. And I think it's also important to realize that there was huge damage that was done to things like the State Department during that first Trump presidency. A lot of the most senior US diplomats said, right, okay, I'm just not going to hang around and deal with this anymore. I'm going to retire. There were people that held on, and one wonders if Trump wins, what you're going to see happen there, especially with talk of replacing civil servants and making it much more across the board political appointees. I think for all of these reasons, I tend to be a little bit more worried about, what the implications of a Trump presidency will be. And I think, one last thing I'll say as well is that it's a strange one with Trump, because on the one hand, I think there are certain tendencies of isolationism. As Michael pointed out, this isn't new. I remember in the 1990s that at the time when the US was getting involved in places like Somalia and saying we should be the world policeman, that you had voices like Pat Buchanan, a voice that many young Americans probably have no idea who he was. But this was a very influential voice at the time in Republican politics and on right-wing politics in the United States, saying, look, hang the rest of the world. It's not our business. It's not our problem. We're not going over there to send our troops to fight for these people. If Somalis want to kill each other, that's not for us. I think there's an element of that in the MAGA crowd. What I think that also makes it very troubling is that that's not the intellectual position that Trump takes, because I don't think, and everyone, Trump doesn't do intellectual positions on things. What I think, though, we are seeing is that Trump does that narcissistic. He wants that power in the United States. He'll get that. If he wins, he gets that power in the United States. He wants to flaunt it on the world stage. And that means that he can't be isolationist. He'll be interacting, but he'll be interacting in all sorts of weird, wonderful, and probably very troubling ways with sorts of people that are very weird, worrying in all sorts of ways. And I think this came out in the debate this week, as people were pointing out. Kamala Harris did a fantastic job of pressing his buttons. She knew exactly what to go for. And other leaders, the Kim Jong-uns of this world, the Vladimir Putins of this world, will also know what buttons to press, with this character, this one that, wants to be considered powerful, wants to be able to, strut the world stage. So I think it creates a very, very troubling and very uncertain and worrying dynamic that I think doesn't exist in the case of other presidents.
No, I think. Well, I just thought the. Sorry, guys. Do you make sure you Michael? I know. I'm glad you don't have any pets, but I'm glad you're not in the US and they're not being eaten by immigrants. But it's a very systemic issue. Sorry, guys, a bit tongue in cheek, because I was up watching the stream and I just was like, okay, it's time for bed now. What's that expression? It's like, that's enough social media for one day. And it's just like, what? I get that there are issues around immigrants and things related to. I think the main issue that's developed is there was a post on Facebook. It was talking about migrants who are sort of trying to maybe capture ducks or something in the park, but that's been conflated to it being actually about all immigrants are now eating pets and stealing them. That's what social media does. It completely conflates and dispels sort of slight details become blurred into other ones, and then you get complete and utter fabricated stories. But anyway, I also think the thing about isolationism is it's a buzzword, right? You love this word, buzzword, Michael, and isolationism is a bit of a buzzword because it sounds satisfactory. It sounds encompassing of something that many people want in America, which is to be isolated from other issues that they don't want their money to be spent on, right? But it's not in reality a very realistic, well, it's completely unrealistic. And I'm just going to be a lot less eloquent and academic sounding or intellectual sounding as James, in that Trump cannot physically be a competent president in the second term because he simply doesn't have an actual solution for Ukraine and Russia. If you listen to the response that he gave to Lex Friedman on his podcast, a couple of weeks ago, the actual segment that Lex has utilized or labeled as Ukraine, Trump doesn't spend any of that time actually addressing the subject. He doesn't really even mention Ukraine in a physical word. He literally just uses it as an opportunity to criticize how bad the Biden and therefore, at extension, Hamas administrations have been and would be. But he doesn't give any actual constructive foreshadowing of what he would do. This whole idea of having a peace deal within 24 hours is just lunacy, partially because obviously you can't guarantee that both sides would agree to any such plan, which the Chinese have had one for a year and a half, might I remind you, and it's not been exactly appreciated by anyone, including the Russians. But also just because it wouldn't physically, it would be, you can't get physically the diplomacy done in 24 hours. It would be physically impossible, right? The time delay, there would be a bit of back and forth here and there. It's just impossible to actually get it. Let's pretend that everyone's like, yeah, sure, we want a peace deal on these, non-existent terms. Sure, it wouldn't be even a reality. So Trump's it's like listening to Andrew Tate for politics. sort of sometimes with Trump. The absurdity of the claims that he says he can reach and achieve, it's just, even if, again, all the stars align and everyone's agreeing with what he wants to do, it's still going to take time. And I don't think he appreciates that. And also, one major step, which I can't believe people seem to forget, is that to achieve a peace deal, you need a ceasefire. And we don't even have that. We don't have the two sides talking, right? If at this point the two sides started talking tomorrow, then maybe by, what is it? When do they come into office? The end of December or whatever, when he's president-elect, right? That's still not enough time probably to get the two talking to an extent where they're like, yes, okay, we've found some terms that we're happy with to hold a temporary or, permanent ceasefire. And then you need an armistice, and then you need a full-scale peace agreement, right? There is not enough consideration of the steps, the physical steps needed to achieve any of these things. So whilst I get what people want, which is they like Trump because he's saying what they want to hear, which is the end of the war and a peace deal and no longer money being sent to Ukraine. I get all of that, but just from a purely logical sense, it's not realistic. And people just seem to think that things can be done at the drop of a hat, which in diplomacy, it really can't, because you're dealing with humans and those emotions are quite tricky things to manage. Anyway, I don't know. I'm sure one of you has some thoughts on what I just said, but otherwise I might want to pivot a little bit. But
pivot.
Jump in. Pivot away. Okay.
Pivot away.
Pivot away. Okay. Pivot away. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Francesco. I appreciate you. The comment section is a little bit of a hot place at the moment. But I wanted to. Oh yeah, this is the best line of the day, Michael. Was you saying that we're all talking to nonsense to someone online? So I thought that was very nice for that. Lips. And then I wanted to talk UN very quickly.
Been Trump sycophants, or maybe it's referring to other people in my comment section. I don't know.
Is Pyotr just your average Polish Russophobe? No, Putin, because if you're intelligent enough to know that I spell my name the Russian way, not Piotr, which is Polish, so you would know actually that I'm Russian before they're spelling my name. But that's a bit awkward for you, isn't it? Let's put that on show for everyone to enjoy. Sorry, I'm not. I'm a bit of a shameless person. I will call you out publicly if you've made a bit of a boo boo.
Actually, what you should do, you should make that a tagline on your page. Pyotr, not just your average Polish Russophobe.
I'm gonna screenshot that. Yes, thank you very much.
Mine will be. I guarantee you, I'm talking nonsense to somebody. I mean, I am.
Yeah. We'll put. Does anyone want these to be t-shirts?
The awful.
What? Oh, this
line from this. I think absolutely we're gonna have to do it on t-shirts. If nothing else,
we should do it on t-shirts. We should do it on mugs, right? Do people want a merch store? We should have like a merch store for stupid statements made on these political podcasts. Anyway, pivot. Okay. Anyway. Okay. Hi, current comment. No, I mean, it's all in good faith. Well, sort of in good faith. But no, just on the UN thing. So very quickly, one of the first questions I saw was about the likelihood that the Russians could be removed from the Security Council. So within about 6 months of the full-scale invasion on February 24th, a lot of effort was done by the Ukrainian diplomatic mission, along with a couple of others, sort of, not the core, shall we say, the P5. And their basic argument is that because when the UN was created, the Soviet Union was given a permanent seat. And obviously at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that suit sort of was de facto given to the Russians, but there was never a vote on it. And the Ukrainians' argument is that because they were along with Belarus, one of the original founders of the UN, they have as much claim to that seat as Russia does. And that also because Russia or the Kremlin has now undertaken this war of, crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity, crimes, war crimes, and in some people's opinions, crimes of genocide. This completely voids Russia's signatory to the UN Charter, right? It is no longer upholding its credentials as for the international security. Well, the UN Security Council looks at peace and security across the international system, because Russia has vagrantly abused that. They have made their membership void, or permanent membership void. They specifically talk about two specific sections regarding. Let me bring it up here. Where is it? I think it's under UN Charter Article 27.2. Basically, they say that there is an argument that basically all standing members of the Permanent Council and therefore the current elected members, so E10, would be able to hold a vote deciding on an objection to the credentials of a Security Council representative that falls under the rules on procedural matters. And then there's another section under Rule 17, which, quote, any representative of the Security Council to whose credentials objection has been made within the Security Council shall continue to sit within the same rights as others until the Security Council has decided the matter, right? So they're saying that the Security Council itself can, in theory, dispute this. Now, this is written by a gentleman called Thomas D. Grant, who's a fellow at the International Law at the University of Cambridge. But I've since spoken to some UN colleagues, and including my former colleague Richard Goen, who's a very prestigious. Well, I consider him one of the more knowledgeable gentlemen on UN matters, and at Crisis Group. And he said, as good as an effort as it was, which it did, it really made some lawyers and UN junkies sit up and be like, is this possible? It's still not likely realistic. So that's sort of my very blurry question to the question that was posed earlier. As I said, it's definitely quite an interesting theory, but to do that, the mechanisms aren't really there. We've also got the UN General Assembly coming up in the next week or so, for the next couple of weeks, and there is growing expectation, from what Richard's told me, that the US is going to make some quite public suggestions about reforming of the Security Council, i.e. to make it more reflective of the international system, mainly because Biden wants it to maybe be one of his legacy pieces. Obviously, that might not be very welcoming for two specific members, France and the UK, because they are not really the powers that they used to be. And so they would be kicked off, or at least some people think they might be kicked off, and countries like India, Brazil, maybe join instead. I don't think that that's likely, because India, UK and France are still nuclear weapon wielding powers. I think it would just be maybe an expansion. So India would join. There are discussions about Germany and Japan, but neither of them are nuclear states. So there's a lot of toing and froing here. But there is, the point I'm making is that there is a lot of discussion about potential UN reform, Security Council reform, which could be, given how many people criticize often the UN and mainly talk about the Security Council, I think it's quite interesting. But anyway, that's my nerdy bit contribution. James, you do law stuff, but like what do you have any inkling about this? Any thoughts on what I said?
This is something that's been going around for a very long time. I mean, it was very interesting. You were sort of saying Thomas Grant sort of writing this piece, and then Richard Gowen sort of coming back on it, because I have to say that those are truly two of the most authoritative voices that you can come up with in terms of sort of international law and international politics of the UN. So I would really highly recommend anyone who's interested in this subject, and it's an incredibly interesting subject, as nerdy as it might seem, to sort of read up on them. But yeah, I mean, look, it has been something that's been said for a long time, and there has been Security Council reform in the past. Remembering, of course, that we all now think of the Security Council as 15 members, but it originally started as 11 members. So you had the 5 permanent and then 6 non-permanent, and that was extended out. So it is possible to do, but the big problem that we've always faced is that it's always been very difficult to say, right, okay, let's have African representation here, but who gets that seat? Is it South Africa would say, well, of course it's us. And then Nigeria says, yeah, but hold on, we're the biggest, most populous country in Africa. And then suddenly you have Ethiopia that says, yeah, but, we're a pretty significant powerhouse. You look at Asia, right, okay, Japan, but then you're going to have Indonesia saying, well, why aren't we there? I mean, we're a hugely populous country, the largest Islamic state in the world. What's our place in all of this? You go to South America, you get Brazil, and then you have Argentina saying, what about us? So this has always been the problem. It's deciding who gets it. And so there's been all sorts of different ways of doing it. I don't think there's any hope and any wish to replicate the veto powers and extend that. I mean, it's difficult. We're snarled up as it is without, introducing a whole raft of new countries. It might be the case that you say, right, okay, what we'll do is we'll also have continental seats, which will rotate between 2 or 3 of the most populous states. So, you would then have Brazil, Argentina, maybe Colombia from South America. You might have, Ethiopia, Egypt, of course, would be another one that would argue the case for Africa. So it then becomes incredibly complicated, and a lot of countries won't vote for something that's not going to include them. So it looks good on paper, and I think we can all agree that the Security Council desperately needs reform. The trouble is, it's one of those situations that once you start to break it down, it's incredibly difficult to see how you break and create a new Security Council.
Yeah, no, 100%. I do think that there are mechanisms that are missing. Richard and I have had, well, to be fully transparent, I worked for Richard as part of Crisis Group a few years ago, but we still have a good relationship based on that. But yeah, I think what's interesting is that there lack, for me at least. I don't know why I'm so interested in the UN system, but I really enjoy talking about it. I don't know. I guess that makes me a true IR nerd, right? But I find
that is one of the qualifications.
I find it really interesting that I wish that there were more mechanisms, right? I think there should be like a freeze or a suspension option. Obviously, this is and to people, I want to make this very clear that I'm not amiss to the limitations or the sort of inefficacy of the United Nations, but I do think that people misunderstand what the UN is actually about. And Michael, I'd welcome your more, put me down, realist perspective. Which is that the UN is but a platform. It's a vehicle by which nation states argue their matters at a multilateral position, right? It has no powers unless the states enable it to have those powers. Of course, it has some influence, but at the end of the day, the UN doesn't just have a bunch of money sitting in hidden storage. It's funded, I should also point out, largely by the United States. But as Richard and I have pointed out in a previous podcast we had almost over a year ago now, China sees a lot of value in the UN. It sees a lot of value in organizations like the World Bank, IMF, because they help further China's desire to reshape the international system. There is a reason that more positions within the World Bank, I think, have been taken by senior Chinese, academics in previous years or whatever. Basically, China has really worked hard to position, get their members of their population into academic institutions and then be able to work in certain multilateral organizations. And countries wouldn't bother if they didn't see value in principle in what the UN is trying to do. Does that mean that the UN is sort of the most useless thing in the world? No, I don't agree. But I think people misunderstand or misconstrue what the UN is able to do, right? First and foremost, it is a it's a place for talking about stuff. That's what diplomacy is. Second, it's about action. We can talk about what it hasn't done. But as Richard also, and I think is a very good example, right? Who's talking to the Afghanistan Taliban right now? There's no legitimization of them as the leadership of the country. Only the United Nations. There's no other entity. You haven't got ASEAN. You haven't got Arab League. You haven't got NATO. No one's doing it. The Chinese sort of have held a few bilateral meetings with some members of the Taliban missions in the past, and I think they're probably going to sign some trade deals in the future. But the point is, when no one else is there, then the UN comes in. And UNAMA, which is the United Nations Afghanistan mission, assistance mission to Afghanistan, is really the only entity on the ground trying to not even promote democracy or human rights. It's literally just trying to create some kind of stabilization within the country so that the economy can function. It's as basic as that. So I strongly push back on anyone who just says the UN is useless and should be removed and all this sort of nonsense, because it's if it was that case, then you just see countries leaving it, and they don't. You see countries continuing to use it to, last example, when Iran was striking Israel on April 13th, where did they send all their diplomatic communiques? Not to the US directly, not to the EU, it was via the UN. And they did that because they wanted to signal to the international community how important they felt the events over Israel's strike into Damascus and just generally the whole situation. I'm not supporting Iran, by the way. I'm just saying, pragmatically speaking, they used the UN because it was the biggest symbolic indication of how seriously they were treating the matter. Anyway, I've probably said a lot of nonsense there to someone. So Michael, what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's not much to add to what was said. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that James had said about sort of the Gordian knot that is the efforts to reform the UN. In terms of which countries might be the most likely candidates, I can definitely tell you that from the Russian side, they are all for expanding the permanent members of the Security Council. India is pretty much up there. There's no question about that. They are opposed to any discussions of Germany and Japan because they see that the United States already has 2 extra votes at the UN with the UK and France. So adding Germany and Japan would, be, in their opinion, useless. But Indonesia, certainly when it comes to Africa, I mean, James was right on the subject again. Do we talk about South Africa? Do we talk about Nigeria, Ethiopia, Egypt? Russia was much more likely to support Brazil in South America over Argentina. But these are just all conceptual ideas. I think that we talk about maybe rotating regional seats. There's also been talk about the possibility of a veto override, where it kills the black ball veto from one of the permanent 5, especially if there is an overwhelming majority in favor of one vote. And let's say the United States vetoes something because it goes against Israel, or China vetoes something because it goes against Taiwan. That could be considered. The problem, though, with all of this is that any suggestions for UN Security Council reform has to be approved by the UN Security Council. So are they going to effectively vote for, will the US, China, will they vote for something that limits their power, right? Will they do that? And the last thing I'll add to this is talks of suspending members, right? Like Russia. The United States is not going to, if they're sensible, the United States is not going to support that. Because if that is the case, then within the same week, the United States is going to be suspended for their open support for Israel. I mean, for their open support for what is effectively genocide in Palestinian territories. So, the U.S. has to tread very lightly when it comes to this. Because if we're going to raise all kinds of human rights violations committed by Russia, which of the 5 currently right now is not committing human rights violations? Probably the UK. I don't know what. You have to think about that for a moment, right? So,
well, I mean, I would never be as blunt to say that. I think that the UK has one of the darkest legacies of any.
Legacies, yes. Legacies, yes. I'm simply talking about, the present period here.
Right now. Some people would agree that, the current, the riots a month ago and the arrests of sort of 11-year-olds, they'll say, well, that's, human rights abuse because you should be arresting 11-year-olds, even though they wrote some deplorable things on Facebook. But anyway, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
But to that point, I mean, both of you were far more succinct in this than I can be.
No, I mean, look, again, I know the UN's quite a niche area. We're not going to, I just wanted to address it a little bit. I think the last thing I would say is that at the end of the day, talking about UN Security Council reform is very, it gets you feeling good, right? It makes you feel like you're doing something of substance, and that change is coming. And it's obviously when we think of the UN, we think of the UN Security Council, but there are many organizations, funds, branches that people just do not, and I don't mean this patronizingly, but people don't understand how the UN works. The World Bank is part of the UN system, but it's actually an organ. It's a sister organization. So the command structure of the World Bank is nominated by the United States, the IMF by the Europeans, and they do not report to Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, right? The president of the World Bank is not, he's at the same level as the Secretary General, right? So they're part of the UN systems. They're working towards trying to improve development initiatives and things like that. But when we talk about the UN, we talk about just usually the Security Council, and that's where we all think, well, the reform should come, but it's not that simple. And so Richard's point is, focus on areas where you might actually see change, talk about areas where you might see. So that's why the votes around Palestine have been very significant, right? Because the votes in the General Assembly do carry weight, but the reason the Palestinians are never put through to achieve statehood is because it would just be shot down by the Security Council. It has to go through the Security Council as well as the UNGA. So it's focus your efforts on areas that you might actually get change, right? I think is Richard's main point. But anyway, let's move to. I think one thing I wanted to touch with both of you, because it's your sort of reasonable regional expertise, and you raised it also, Michael, is Vučić and Serbia. Because I think it's been interesting, his comments in the past few days, hours, even over northern Kosovo. Obviously, Russia's influences in the Balkans is an extension of what we're seeing in Ukraine and just dotted around. With obviously China's developments in the recent months with Serbia signing, I think, a new set of trade agreements, or a few new agreements. So maybe James, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on this point, or any other comments you wanted to mention.
Sorry about that. You caught me. I was just about to lose my battery. So you,
okay. Well, that's okay. Well, bye-bye, James. Bye-bye, everybody.
Around looking for the leads. So just quickly recap again on that, as I was sort of.
It's okay. If you need a minute to set up
all done now. Fortunately, but it literally was about to go, and I was thinking, how am I going to manage this? And I suddenly remembered I had a spare lead. So
okay. Well, yeah. I mean, as always, gentlemen, we're talking for a while, so as and when we're ready to wrap up, we can wrap up. We've been talking, I think, for about an hour and 25 minutes, so I think we could do 2 hours. I think that's a good solid amount. Obviously, if you want to talk, then we can just do that all night. What's better than a Saturday night of that? But no. So my point was, Michael, James, was that Serbia's been in the news in the past few hours, days, because of Vučić's comments and sort of rumblings around northern Kosovo. Obviously, China was there recently with President Xi's rather weird trip around sort of random countries in Europe, including Hungary, and Serbia, where they signed a few agreements, I believe. So I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit of your reaction to the developments from Vučić, and then we'll jump over to Michael, because he actually originally raised it at the beginning of the stream.
Look, I mean, Kosovo is just one of those issues which rumbles on and on and on, and I think for a lot of us who certainly followed the Balkans for a long time, it just becomes frustrating, and to the point that I've seen more and more people drift off. I mean, metaphorically as well as sort of in reality, when it comes up, because it just seems that it's caught in this time warp. That said, there are very real problems on the ground. That I think there are real worries also that it's getting worse, that tensions are rising. I think that we are definitely seeing. I think, as I say, we're seeing problems that I think should be more manageable than they are, and I'm not quite sure why. I think there's a whole range of reasons that we could potentially look to on it. That I think there's a lack of ambition in terms of the international community on how to deal with the Kosovo issue. But what I would say is that it desperately does need to be resolved. I think this is just a running sore. We see these spikes in tensions. I think it is interesting to see that Vučić is now talking about taking action against any Serbs who are sort of raising tensions in that. So he's obviously been told quite clearly that it's time to pull down the pressure on this and to be seen to be acting. But of course, there is also a lot of worry about Albin Kurti and the way that he's been behaving. He's a hothead. He's been trying to exert Prishtina's control over the north, and in ways that actually I think a lot of us who follow the Balkans would find rather ironic, because of course part of the problem that we saw, the roots of the Kosovo crisis that we saw in 1999 was precisely because Milosevic was going in and trying to exert central government control over the people there. So it really is one of these sort of things I think a lot of us who watch the region find terribly frustrating. That for some reason it just seems to be immune to breaking, and there are so many other issues that we need to be paying attention to at the moment. And just to see this coming up again, I know, Michael, you follow it very closely as well and have your thoughts on it. Sorry, I actually find myself finding it very, very difficult to get animated about this subject, and it's one that I've written lots about. I've published books on and things. I've just lost the energy for it. I'm being really, really honest with you now. I found talking about UN Security Council reform so much more interesting and invigorating. Yeah, there, said it.
Michael?
Well, if Albin Kurti is listening right now, he's very happy. He's very happy because I think that that's his goal, is to just get people tired about Kosovo, tired of the region, so he can effectively take control. Look, Kosovo's a frozen conflict brought on by the West, thinking that it could create a country outside of any international legal framework, outside of UN Security Council approval, and for the last 15 plus years has been assuming that Kosovo's self-proclaimed independence is self-evident, while still adhering to Ukraine's territorial integrity. The Western coalition, which is really, let's be perfectly honest here, I mean, it's the United States, the UK, France, and Germany insisting that Kosovo is just as much of a sovereign independent state as Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania, Greece, Turkey, and what have you. Kosovo is not in the UN. It has no chance of getting into the UN. It is not in NATO or the EU. It does not have any chance of getting in either. It is a disputed territory. James has written about Kosovo and other contested territories. I have written articles both in academia and for the public on what I call parastates, which is like a de facto state, but operates in direct violation of another state's territorial integrity. And, to Serbia's credit, when you talk about the Balkans, you inevitably take one side slightly over the other here. And so, I have to acknowledge that Serbia has been trying to be a team player with the EU for years now. Russia's influence within the Balkans, I think, is now largely exaggerated in light of the war in Ukraine. Russia's influence in the Balkans has really dwindled down to a couple of right-wing nationalist groups within the Balkans. And Serbia knows this, and it realizes that it needs to realign itself foreign policy-wise, cooperation-wise, with key members of Western Europe and NATO. The United States being a chief partner in that. U.S.-Serbian relations have actually gotten quite better under Vučić. So Vučić's big statement, and this is what we've been talking about, right, is that this is in response to a concerted number of efforts by Kosovo's president, Albin Kurti, who is, as James says, he's a hothead, he's a nationalist, he's an ideologue, he's a relic, really, of the 1990s. He comes from the same mold as the Tudjmans, the Izetbegovićs, Milosevic's, among others, except he's just 20 years late to the game. The man believes that Kosovo should be ethnically Albanian. In fact, if given his, given his leeway, he would merge it with Albania itself. He's a pan-Albanian nationalist. He's a member of a Greater X project. And the big problem also with this idea of making Kosovo some kind of multi-ethnic state in the Balkans is that Albanians largely play along with that simply to put Kosovo on the map, right? It was this Faustian bargain that the West had given Kosovo Albanian leaders in the mid 2000s, which is, we'll support your element of statehood, but you have to create a state that is multi-ethnic and gives lots of minority rights to the Serbs. And for most of the Albanian leaders, whatever means to the end got them to statehood, then so be it. But for them, it's a realization of a long-time national project. And Kurti is probably one of the best exemplars of this today. So for him, Serbs need to be reduced to less than 5% of the population, be nothing more than an ethnographic oddity for NGOs to go to for cookouts and folk dances. No institutional autonomy whatsoever, despite the fact that there was an agreement reached in 2015, I think. The Brussels agreement was in 2000. I could be wrong. I forget what year it was because it was so long ago. Even I get blurred on this. But there was an agreement between Pristina and Belgrade over moving forward with Kosovo. But every single agreement does not come, because it cannot come, with Serbia's pressure to recognize Kosovo. At no point is there ever any ultimatum. The closest that you can get is maybe every so often some German diplomat says, no EU for Serbia if they don't recognize Kosovo, which at this point, many politicians in Serbia are saying, okay, fine, I'll go and join BRICS. I'll go hang out with the Chinese. I'll go, do a bilateral state-to-state relation if that's the only thing. So Vucic's response at this point is in, I think, finally taking a stand against efforts by Kurti to goad the Serbian side into responding. What Kurti wants is Vucic to take the bait and send in the military, in which he can turn around to NATO and say, look at this, it's genocide all over again. The apple doesn't fall from the tree, Vucic, Milosevic, that kind of stuff. But I have to also say, it's not just northern Kosovo. It's all of Kosovo. There are Serbs that live in Kosovo center and south. And while people like to think that they're more integrated with Kosovo's institutions, it's the north that is the flashpoint, because it's the northern areas that has never come under the control of Pristina's authorities. Pristina will look at these Serbian institutions in the north and call them parallel illegal institutions. Again, an ironic statement, because it was Kosovo's road to quasi-independence through parallel institutions during the Milosevic period. So, for those that follow this, I mean, the irony is just that both sides have now completely flipped. The EU doesn't really do anything. They say something, they wag their finger at Kurti, but nothing really happens. The United States seems to have forgotten about it, because it just seems that Kosovo will solve itself. The invisible hand theory will just simply solve Kosovo's issue. And at the end of the day, it's not just Serbs that are leaving, but Albanians are leaving as well. Kosovo's biggest export is its own people, because they've had enough. There's no point in staying. And so it is at some point, and I mean, it's one of the, least functional areas within the Balkans. I absolutely agree with James. It is a ticking time bomb. I don't see that there will be wide-scale violence, but what I do see is that there will most likely now be coordinated efforts at resistance by the Serbian side in northern Kosovo, which Kurti will see as open aggression, and of course use his followers and his fans on Twitter to effectively say that Serbia has not learned its lessons since the 1990s. And he plays into the sympathy that exists among many pro-EU NGO movements that still see the Balkans through that lens: Serbs bad, everyone else good. And at the end of the day, I mean, James has kind of thrown his hands up a little bit before me, but I mean, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. I'll say this one more thing to tie this into the UN and UN reform, and this might be a radical suggestion here. We talk about UN reform, but we only focus on the Security Council. Officially, one of the main elements of the UN is this thing called the Trusteeship Council, which still has a major room in the New York office, but it's largely defunct. And many people don't know about this. Trusteeship Council was basically set up in the early days of the UN as a legacy element of the League of Nations to deal with territory that has not yet become fully sovereign. And this is dealing with post-German colonies in World War I that were given mandate status to British colonies in Southern Africa. All right, real obscure thing, okay? And I think the last time that this was, I forget which territory or whatever was incorporated, the trusteeship council is effectively just, it's an empty room. My radical suggestion is disputed territories like Kosovo, Northern Cyprus, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Palestine, Western Sahara, they have no chance of getting into the UN as a sovereign state at the moment. But giving them some kind of representation there in the trusteeship council as at least a organized territory, disputed in terms of its status, but at least some kind of link to the UN in which greater efforts at coordinated development, modernization, and stabilization could and should be taken, into account. Because, Northern Cyprus is, or Transnistria, right? These little isolated places that people forget about. But we tend to forget that people live there, and it's been their home. But we don't want frozen conflict.
I want to hear James's perspective as well, because I think you've shared quite a lot of extensive information there. And actually, on that point, Michael, one thing you did say, the para-states. We're going to do a video on that, aren't we? We've got a deep dive on this concept and sort of point of yours, which I think is worth. I'm nerdy like that. I like international relations theory, and whether a country like Belarus is a client state, or whether Ukraine would become a rump state if Russia got its way, and things like that. Trying to sort of, I found that Uruguay's entire existence was because it was created as a buffer between Brazil and Argentina, and I didn't know that. I thought that was really interesting. But anyway, James, do you, Michael said a lot of things there. I saw you nodding at times.
I have to say that, Michael,
as long as you're not exhausted about talking about it, just checking. Oh no, we've lost James. Oh, did we lose James? No, we didn't lose.
No,
James.
I can hear him.
You can hear. 1 second.
Okay. Well, whilst James corrects himself, but I think it's interesting that you guys both feel slightly exasperated with the Kosovo file like that. From my understanding, there have been frustrations, I think, within NATO and KFOR itself about what they consider to be sort of slight provocations from Pristina, or unnecessary sort of provocations from Pristina. I don't follow too much on that file as much, but James, Michael,
I'll add one more thing. I'll add one more thing before that, before James can add. But among the Albanian political elite within Pristina today, there is growing hostility against Kurti because of what they see as worsening relations between Kosovo and the United States. So for them, the United States is their sponsor. It's their lifeline. It's the only place in the world you can go to see a statue of Bill Clinton. So for Albin Kurti and his party, Self-Determination, to be fraying relations with the United States, this is like beyond unacceptable for them. Like this is an embarrassment for them. But yeah, I just wanted to throw that one out too.
Okay, James, what do you think? I mean, the Bill Clinton thing.
Well, done. I mean, you made an excellent case for why we should be paying more attention, and I think it doesn't take me much to get wound up about Kosovo and start going on about it again, because I think you raised all sorts of important issues about why we do need to take it. And I think part of the problem I have is that we're not having the conversation in the West about the role that Kosovo played in leading us to a very troubling situation that we see in Ukraine at the moment. I know this is not a popular opinion to express, but it's an opinion that we have to take on board. And this isn't trying to excuse what Russia has done or what Putin has done in Ukraine. But, I do remember a senior State Department official being interviewed and saying that, at the time in 2008, they were making the decision on whether to recognize Kosovo, that there were apparently discussions within the State Department. And this was a senior official who ambassadorial level saying, you do know that, this is going to have knock-on effects. And they just said, look, we've got no choice. We've got to do this. Otherwise, there will be renewed violence in Kosovo. We're not in a position to manage this. We're going to have to give it independence, and we're just going to have to take the risk of the consequences. And there were a lot of voices that speaking out. And, I've said before, I don't stand against Kosovo independence. I think it makes all sorts of sense, and it's a very logical outcome, but it was done completely. It was done in a wrong way, and a wrong way that opened up all sorts of problems and tremendous whataboutism that we get. You cannot now have a discussion about Ukraine without people jumping in and saying, what about Kosovo? And it has created, and it's a very difficult question to answer. I think that there are ways that we can sort it out. I think there are solutions to Kosovo, but again, these have been stymied. They've been presented by various governments, and I'll be very honest on this. Britain and Germany have taken the lead on this, and I've been very outspoken on this, and I think it's a great shame. I think we have had options to solve Kosovo in a way that can square the circle, that can also sort of mean that both Kosovo, because this is immensely damaging, not just for Kosovo, but also for Serbia and for the entire region. We need to try and sort this out, but it just becomes difficult to see a way out of it. And I think, Michael, you're absolutely right. I think this sort of jaded sense, absolutely what Kurti wants to do. So I shouldn't be playing into those hands. And I find, and I'll be very honest, I find Kurti abhorrent. He leads an organization called Self-Determination, but it means self-determination only for one peoples. It could not be more hypocritical. Yeah. He argues something that he denies to everyone else, and he's just he's a troublemaking nationalist of the old order who just frankly found himself in power because he was promising, and there were lots of problems with the previous parties and things like that. And he's doing tremendous damage. So Michael, it hasn't taken a lot to press that button. With me. But look, I think, can I just quickly say that I think that idea of this trusteeship council, I think is actually really interesting in all sorts of ways, because at first blush you think, oh gosh, this is going to give all sorts of legitimacy to breakaway territories, which I think can actually be quite troubling. But on the other hand, what you're saying to them is, we're going to give you mechanisms to develop, to start to build ties with the international community. But until you reach a settlement, you're going to sit in the anteroom. You're going to be there. So if you want to move into the main UN General Assembly chamber, you're going to either have to sit down and talk with the country that you've broken away from, or you're going to agree to how you reintegrate. But what we can do at the moment is help with your development to make that. So I think there's an argument to say, and there's a whole body of literature that, those of us who work on this, it's called engagement without recognition. And one of the arguments is that if you keep them isolated, all you do is force them into the hands of their patron state. Now, for things like Transnistria, for Abkhazia, South Ossetia, that means Russia. Whereas if you engage with them, then actually you can draw them away. The trouble is the parent state, as the country they broke away with, always gets nervous because they think if you develop them too much, they're going to have no wish to reintegrate. That pushes against it. And you're dealing with that tension a lot of the time when you're truly trying to deal with conflict resolution in these sorts of situations. And that could actually be a really, really interesting and productive way of doing it, of saying, as I say, you will have some sort of status, but it's not going to be as a sovereign state. But, so it socializes them, which is something that we desperately need in a lot of these cases.
But what could the case be made? What about, the most obviously newest country, South Sudan? And Sudan, obviously, it's not a perfect example because they're not exactly at peace generally within themselves as well as between themselves. But, South Sudan did break away. Mm-hmm. And there was no sort of idea that Sudan as a parent state might want them to rejoin at some point. Or is it because there was such a mutual happiness for South Sudan and its religious divides to shift away?
Can I just jump in on this one? Yeah. I don't know, Mike, if you've got any particular take on South Sudan, but I'd say South Sudan's a fascinating example because it wasn't a case of unilateral secession. Yes, it fought a very, very long-standing civil war and effectively wore down the Sudanese government. It was actually a fascinating story because actually their big victory, the South Sudanese were very different from the North Sudanese. So Northern Sudan is essentially Arab and Muslim. The south is sub-Saharan African and Christian and animist. And it was basically shoehorned together by the British and the Egyptians in the 19th century. It was never a logical country in many ways. And they fought this, what was at the time the longest civil war in Africa. And essentially what happened is you had Christian evangelicals in the United States who picked up on the fact that this was a war between Christians and Muslims at the start of the 2000s, at the time around 9/11 and after. And they took on the cause. And you had a you had a Sudanese government that had become a pariah under Bashir, who was leaning in Islamist direction. So it was a coming together of various things. But effectively, Sudan agreed to South Sudan's independence. The peace deal was actually very interesting. It sort of said, look, South Sudan will have its autonomy, and after 6 years, they'll have a vote whether they want to continue that autonomy, or if they reject it, they'll become independent. So effectively what it said to the South Sudan, to Sudan's government is you've got 6 years, and I use this phrase often, to love bomb the South, to prove why they should remain part of the Sudanese state. I think we all knew where it was going. And I actually said that this was actually a very good model for Kosovo and Serbia, that had you been able to negotiate in good faith and openly and rationalize and reason with the two sides, this would have been a better option. It would have given a face-saving way to the Serbs to essentially relinquish Kosovo, but say to them, listen, Kosovo will get all sorts of autonomy short of statehood, and that's going to last for a certain number of years. And at the end of it, they're going to have a vote on whether they want to continue the autonomy. And if they reject it, then they go their own way. And it was a model, as I say, that had been laid down for South Sudan. And I always felt that that would have been a much better route. The trouble is, it was very difficult at the time, partly because in Kosovo, the population had run out of patience, and they were threatened that it was going to blow up. And essentially NATO, especially NATO, said, look, we can't take the risk of it. We've got to rush this through. But I think I always say, if there was more of a fixation on the concept of independence rather than the word independence, then I think that would have been a much more reasonable and rational way of doing it. So Sudan's actually, in South Sudan, is a fascinating case. And in actual fact, just to point out, Sudan was the first country in the world to recognize South Sudan. So it wasn't unilateral secession. It was an agreed one. So it falls into...
Very good point. I forgot that detail. No, I mean, it's very, I mean, the Horn is something that I look at very much, and I followed extensively the Ethiopian civil war, and obviously the sort of arguments can be made about Tigray and the secession there. I think it's Article 49 under the Ethiopian constitution talks about sort of, the construction of the state and whether or not it's...
Yes, Ethiopia is one of very few countries in the world that actually constitutionally permits secession, but good luck getting it.
Yeah, exactly. And it was the most bloody war of this century, right? I don't think a lot of people know this, but while Ukraine is obviously the biggest,
almost uncovered in much of the Western press.
500,000, 1 million, I think, fatalities, some estimates put. Anyway, but that is something I do want to cover more, is Ethiopia, Sudan, and generally the African continent. So if anyone watching has any recommendations for people I should talk to or anything they want me to cover, then do comment on that. One comment I wanted to draw attention to before we draw down for probably the final one, just a couple of my favorite comments here. This one starting, thank you very much for that, Oblomov. I'm not sure yet. I'm still thinking about it. And then this one was my favorite other one from Azure Jester earlier on in the conversation as well. Second powerful military. And we've also had Lemonlight. He's planning they're planning their Clinton statue world tour. And then Mr. Mordecai is pushing for some crowdfunding to help you with your electronics hardware situation, James. So we've got some...
you know what? Can I just point out, it's because I've gone too high tech. I'm using a really, really good camera, which is just power hungry, rather than my laptop. Thank you very much for the suggestion of helping to fund my equipment. It's overfunded already.
Yes, if you do want to support James's crowdfunding, or I don't know, if Michael was looking to crowdfund or my crowdfunding, then please do get in touch. I'm being slightly facetious, but no, we hope you've enjoyed the conversation. Michael, aside from everything James said, I really enjoyed listening to you guys because you're much more in-depth awareness of the details there. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, but I did want to offer a couple of quick fire questions to you guys as we sort of finish, which is, what are your thoughts on the UK's expulsion of the 6 diplomats that are expelled by Russia? Do you think that that's going to mean an escalation between the UK and Russia bilaterally? And if not, why? And then I'll come to you, James, for your thoughts, and then we've got one more question, and then we'll probably wrap for this evening. But Michael, any thoughts?
I mean, Russian-UK relations are as low as they can get, so I don't know how much lower they can get at this point. So the expulsion is not going to really change any of the dynamics on the ground.
Okay, James?
I completely agree. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's not really going to change anything for those of you who asked. It's never good. But countries do this all the time. If Russians and America always exchange or, reject their ambassadors, and then you get what's called the Shah d'affaires, who is the second in command, is replaced. What's significantly bad is if they start closing down the entire system itself. Embassies can operate without an ambassador. Diplomats, you don't want Russia to completely get UK to close all of its embassy, because that's another level, because then you don't have any diplomatic communication at all. But it doesn't suddenly mean that you're going to see, the Russian submarines coming around Norway and into the UK Thames. So it's more a reflection of the broader situation. And then we've got another one here from TJCMN. I'll pose this to you, James, first. Do you think policymakers in Washington are inclined to overlook countries like Vietnam and India's relatively pro-Russian position if it means that they will aid America and the West against China? Basically, pragmatism over idealism, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. You have to make those decisions. I mean, that's the thing. It's how far you want to push it, yeah, I mean, policymakers. I think this is one of the things that and without people's heads sort of exploding, I always knew it. So I have worked in UK government in the Foreign Office in the past, and it was a fascinating experience. And I think more academics should have that opportunity to do it, because it gives you a very, very different take on the world and the way that decisions have to be made and things balanced. It's I think there's a lot of idealism on the outside about how things should be done, and then when you're confronted with the reality, and I think this is exactly a case of it. I think one country that I do feel very, very uncomfortable with, that I think we should be doing more, is India.
Yes.
I think that it's trying to sit on the fence, and it's actually behaving in bad faith. You can understand that certain countries, they're much smaller, they're much more difficult. India is a real weak link in the global attempt to try and put pressure on Putin over this. And I think, as I say, it's, you'll have a lot of Indians who are saying, well, this is in Modi putting India first, and that this is in India's best interest. But the reality is then, it becomes untrustworthy, and people don't want to trust it, because they see this as a country that will just stand out for its own interests and not actually sort of be part. So at the same time, you've got, Modi doing this, trying, helping Russia out, but at the same time, it's expecting the West to come fully behind it via the Quad in its own internal problems, or its own concerns about China's rise. And I think that's one of those cases where you could definitely have sort of, put more pressure on India to say, listen, if you've got to make your choice. What is it? Are you going to saddle yourself to helping Putin? But if you want our help in terms of challenging China's rise, and we can understand your concerns on that, then you need to be doing a little bit more to clamp down on Putin and not give him the lifeline that they have been doing. So I think in many smaller countries, I'm a little bit more inclined to understand the sort of balance that you find, especially when, offsetting against sort of big geopolitical forces. But I think India is the one that, as I say, I've felt very uncomfortable about for quite a long time.
I mean, a large proportion of my channel audience is from India. I'm very lucky to have so many people who are passionate about such a wonderful country, and I still need to visit. Actually, it's somewhere I haven't been. But I think some of them would disagree with your sentiments, James, or maybe find it quite Western in the sense. No, it's not a necessarily criticism. It's more of an observation, and then I think Indians like, why do we have to feel obligated to align to the West, right? We have our strategic autonomy, and we can damn well do as we please. And I do think, but I do agree with you 100%. Sorry,
yeah, the West comes around and says, well, if that's the way that you want to be, then why do we have to sort of take an interest and help you in your concerns about China? We'll deal with it, but setting up multilateral institutions or bodies such as the Quad, which includes India, Japan, Australia, United States,
and the ITU too, right? Don't forget the Middle Eastern one. The one in the Middle East between Israel, UAE, Emirates, US, and India as well, right? They're being quite active down there. But yeah, no, I think the point is that India also should be, I think, part of the Security Council. I think we've made that very clear. You made it very clear earlier on that India is also very. I just don't understand why it's not important more in terms of critical conversations, particularly when it comes to Russia. Modi's visits to Ukraine and hugging Putin is obviously very, Modi has been very influential, I think, of public diplomacy like that, But Michael, I don't know, any quick takes on this question?
I mean, a short answer, probably. I guess probably. The West, pro-Russia, pro-China. I mean, the West is still playing this game that, Russia and India are going to eventually they're going to be had by China, because China's the real, challenger, the real global rival down the road. I mean, they're all members of BRICS. They're members of Shanghai Cooperation. And whether or not this is just rhetorical statements for the camera, or whether this is actual policy, Russia, China, and India's relations are actually getting closer. They're getting more integrated as time goes on. So, the West, it's really the West versus the rest. And the rest oftentimes have different dynamics in how they relate to one country over another. India, again, might be too big, too autonomous. We don't know. We don't know what will happen when either Modi is replaced as prime minister by the BJP, or the BJP is voted out and Congress comes back in. When it comes to countries like Vietnam or Indonesia, Malaysia, we also have to remember that NATO is looking to create this little spin-off called AUKUS, which is trying of like this, little NATO of the Southeastern Pacific, with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the United States. So whether these smaller countries see the West as integrative and accommodating, or whether they see them as a potential rival, will determine that.
Wait, did you mean AUKUS, the deal with the UK and the Australians over the submarine nuclear capable?
Well, that agreement? Is one of them. No, that's one of it. That is certainly one of those cases. But no. It's that. What is it? AUKUS. It's this acronym.
That's not with Japan, and that's with the UK and Australia. That's
right. I think that there's talk. There is talk. There's always talk about NATO's not expanding membership, certainly, but expanding its interest.
Well, we used to have. We used to have SEATO until the 1970s, right? It was the South East Asian Treaty Organization. I think that's literally what it stood for, right? So, and then that was discontinued for whatever reasons. But there's a lot of discussion. I mean, one of the legacies I think of Biden will be his ability to have, not that it's fully resolved the issue, but it's the trilateral agreements, summits between Japan and South Korea. These two countries are incredibly have terrible relations for obvious reasons, but Biden has done an incredible job of trying to bring them into the modern age and sort of restore them or engage some degree of rapprochement. So I think that there's a lot there to build on. I don't think there's going to be a NATO in Asia, so to speak. But just to the question, my 2 cents is that, absolutely, I think the US does this anyway, right? Vietnam is an incredibly important strategic partner for the Americans vis-a-vis China in the first island chain. I mean, my best example is actually Niger in the Sahel, because when the coup happened in summer of 23, the Americans were actually very quick to simply normalize relations, despite the elected democratic leader being removed and basically the United States being told by the new coup government to get the hell out. They normalized their relations, and you've still got the 600, I think, troops living in of the US living in Niger. So it shows you that behind all the hullabaloo about democracy and everything, the US is still playing a very realpolitik, pragmatic game. And where they can or where they have to, they will work with semi-autocratic or, you know, hybrid. Well, Turkey is a case in point, right? How much do we rely on Turkey disproportionately in NATO, despite their relations with Russia and everything? So, and India, I think, is just the biggest example of that because of how important India is. And someone asked a question about that. I don't think India will ever become an ally. But I do think that, just a question here, yeah, they do play a balancing act, but I think it's more push-pull policies from the West and China. And I think push comes to shove, India will obviously support any defense of Taiwan against China. But that's a scenario that I don't think we're going to see for a while. Anyway, I wanted to wrap up because I think both gentlemen have had enough of my voice and my questions and going back and forth over Kosovo, which no offense to Kosovo, but as James said, he can't do it. I'm being facetious.
Well, until I did.
Yes, I'd like to give you guys an opportunity. Is there anything you guys have coming up that you want to share with your viewers or news? Hopefully, some of you, if you haven't already, do check out these guys' channels. James, have you got anything coming up that you are looking forward to? Okay, Michael, do you have anything you've got coming up?
I have to think about it.
Okay, Michael, anything you've got? Like, I don't know, you interviewing anyone interesting? Or
interviewing. Well, I've got paper grading, unfortunately. There's nothing interesting about that.
What look for the video episode, everyone.
Right. What I am, you know, is we were talking way in the beginning about, you know, Fukuyama and Huntington, and, you know, what kind of started the whole post-Cold War era. You know, 2026 is the 30th anniversary of Huntington's book being published. And so I'm starting a project sort of examining Huntington's Clash of Civilizations 30 years later. You know, was he right? Was he wrong in spite of himself? You know, where, you know, the book was, you know, widely read and criticized, and some of his predictions at the time were, you know, wildly fantastic. And yet at the same time, here we are, 2024, 2025. And again, this is just me doing my translations with Putin and Lavrov. We hear words like multipolarism and clash of civilizations and security dilemmas, and either they are hidden IR majors or their interns are IR majors. But you know, the book is not openly cited, but it's referenced, and it's worth taking a look at, especially his section on Ukraine, which he called a cleft country. And I'm not a fan of Huntington's social character theory. It basically is a very macro-oriented way of looking at lumping people together in by, you know, culture. But still, it's something that I am starting to do. Hopefully, we'll have something presentable by the 30th anniversary.
Well, okay, a long-term project. James, anything of such caliber?
No, but it's just great to hear that, you know, Michael's working on this, because as you know, we talked about a little bit earlier, I mean, these, you know, the end of history and the clash of civilizations were the two books that really defined the early 1990s and, you know, shaped the whole outlook in many ways of many people who are now in senior positions in sort of world affairs, in academia, in government, and things like that. It was incredibly influential, and yet probably not something neither book are read now by undergraduates. But they are having a truly lasting impact in their own different ways.
Yep.
Yeah, on that point, I think legacy points. I wanted to leave us with a couple of comments actually before we wrap. Shavo said this one, so I'm very glad we made you laugh. That's obviously what we're here to do. This one from Gunny, I agree. I hope he also has his pants on, but you never know with the Clinton sometimes. And then most important, from London Sport War, thank you for watching. And if you haven't subscribed to Michael or James, go and do that. And if you found any of us particularly of value, then consider joining our communities. We do get together on I tend to just message these guys the day before and be like, hi, do you want to go chat about politics? And like, yeah, maybe. Michael always seems to be down for it at some point. James is a little bit more like, well, I need a little bit more time because I have actually a life, and unlike myself and definitely Michael. No, I'm joking, actually. I'm joking. Anyway, thank you very much, guys, for watching. It's been a real pleasure. We'll definitely do more of these in the next few weeks ahead and stuff. Lots to talk about. And yes, we are Western, but we try to acknowledge the inconsistencies, hypocrisy, and other perspectives around the world as well. But thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Ta-ra.